here with the very latest. Fox News White House correspondent Peter Doocy. Peter, let me first ask you about the tape. I played it last night, and I played it tonight, and I look at the audience reaction, and it's been the same both nights. Basically, horror. They cannot believe what a horrible cognitive moment that was for President Biden. The question is, did anyone bring that up today? Is anyone talking about that in the Washington press corps?
Well, there's no press briefing today, so limited opportunities to talk to them directly about the trip. I would say when it comes to issues of foreign policy, that is what President Biden considers to be his expertise. And so I think when you see clips like that, it is just him being more deliberate to make sure that he doesn't say the wrong thing at a time when one wrong word could have people start to attack Israel from the north, people start to attack Israel from the south, Iran start to shoot missiles again, as if they're not already provoked, at U.S. troops somewhere in the world. And so my read on that as somebody that watches every single comment that President Biden makes was that he was just trying to be really, really deliberate on a trip. He's more dressed up in the sweater than we usually are when we travel with him. I'm usually in a full sweatsuit. And so I think he was just trying to be as deliberate as possible. While that was happening, though, while they were on the way back, we know that there was this post. He talked about meeting with first responders. The White House social media channels posted a photo where you could see the faces, the full faces of at least 4 special operators. And that is a big problem because those are the faces of the guys that are the tip of the spear. Those are the faces of people that go fight terrorists all around the world and don't want the terrorists to know who they are or where they are when they return back to the United States. We don't know tonight if the person or persons responsible for that have been punished. We don't know tonight if the White House thinks that is something that somebody should be punished for. We just know that as soon as they found out about it, they took it down because they understand the sensitivity of the situation. We know that tomorrow President Biden is going to have some European leaders here from the European Council. They will no doubt talk more about this. And remember, his election in 2020 was not about foreign policy. We had the foreign policy elections in 4, 08, 12, 16. 2020 was all about COVID. And for the first couple years, really, it felt like all of his biggest addresses were about advances that the country was making against the pandemic. Now he's got to convince the United States that he is in control and that the United States can take control of 2 different wars without actually sending U.S. troops to fight in them. And we'll see if he can do it. Sean?
Great point. Let me ask you this, Peter. The president referenced tonight America after 9/11. We lost 2,977 Americans that day. If you extrapolate out, he keeps lecturing us on American rage and that mistakes were made. And if you extrapolate out and compare populations with all the people that were murdered, beheaded, the women raped, the children even beheaded, the babies beheaded, all the people taken hostage, it would be the equivalent of losing 38,000 Americans in a single day. And my question is, if I lost my child and my baby was beheaded or a loved one of mine was raped or taken hostage or murdered, I think there would be rage that would last in me for the rest of my life. Although I know the Lord's Prayer says, forgive us as we forgive, I would have a really hard time and struggle the rest of my life to, I guess, repress that rage. This is justifiable anger here that they have. And not only that, to me, the goal has got to be for Israel, this can no longer, Gaza can no longer be a staging ground for them to fire tens and tens of thousands of rockets into Israeli cities. That has to be one of their main goals, and I would imagine that's true, right?
Yes, and when he talks about mistakes that the U.S. made after September 11th, 2001, he's talking about how he thinks the United States stayed engaged in Afghanistan and looking for essentially, or trying to figure out what they were doing in Afghanistan after Osama bin Laden was caught and killed. He saw that as the main reason to go in. He was the vice president when they got bin Laden, and he thought that that was the time for the United States to just pull out and move on. And I think in terms of the rage, they are prioritizing keeping innocent civilians in Gaza safe. I saw President Biden, the last time I talked to him was on Friday. It was very brief, but I asked him what worries him about a potential Israeli ground operation into Gaza. And his answer, just one word, death. And when he talks tonight about bringing terrorists to justice, I don't think that he is worried about terrorists dying. And we've seen that over the course of his presidency. He has taken out terror leaders with over-the-horizon capabilities. He's talking about innocent civilians. And so that's why he's working the phones, trying to figure out how to get aid to these innocent civilians. And he's saying, if Hamas tries to hijack these trucks, if they're the ones taking the food and the water and the medicine, it's going to stop. And so I think when he talks about he wants them not to make any mistakes, it is just that he wants to make sure that the Israelis are adhering to the rules of war and that innocent people are not caught in the crossfire, which is almost impossible if innocent people are being used as human
Israelis have been
shields.
warning the population, if you stay, you will die. They've been doing it for weeks now. All right, Peter Doocy, as always, thank you. Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.